The starting point with Seymour is a large towel that I've rolled up and then folded over in half as well to make it even smaller. And he gives me a head nod, which is his start button, and I decide to just show it to him and see if he's interested in sniffing it or exploring it at all. He's pointedly ignoring it and giving me further start buttons. It gives it a bit of a look there, and then it looks like he thinks it might be a face target as he steps towards it. So I decide to give him some food and just start the small exposures, standing more near his girth. So I won't offer it to him to look at or nose target or anything like that, because it's not something I would normally do with a rug. If I come with a rug, he's going to see it straight off. He's going to know what it is. But at this stage, I'm starting with the smallest exposure of it I can. And there was his head nod, which was his start button. And I gently lay the towel on his wither. So this first section is a bit of an experimental one, where I'm finding where his threshold is basically. You see him stop chewing there, which is, he's giving me the start button. I press it on his back, he stops chewing. Give him some more food, and I might do a smaller exposure. So that was quicker as a smaller exposure. And as I said, this is an experimental session where I'm going to try different things and just find where he's okay, he keeps eating. And you saw this time he stopped momentarily eating and then continued to eat. And I thought it might actually be better to leave it on his back. He might feel more comfortable with having more food with it just sitting on his back rather than on and off his back. And I think that's a good first session just to see where he's at. So most likely resting on his back is a little bit too soon for him, from seeing him stop eating when it touched him. So I start a bit of flapping, and you see he looks away a little bit there, but he gives me that start button. So I do a little bit less flapping for a briefer amount of time, and he seemed a lot more okay with that. So there's always going to be an ebb and flow. I'll try something, see if he's okay. If he's not, I'll do less or for a quicker amount of time, and then might try again a bit later. So this time, instead of touching him, I'm just hovering over his back with the towel, and he looked pretty comfortable with that. Another head nod, start button. This time just fiddling with the towel, so something even easier. Because when we think about it, putting a rug on, there's going to be a bit of fiddling and juggling. And the rug actually makes a lot of jingling noises, whereas the towel doesn't. So just jiggling it to start with without the noises is another good smaller exposure. And interestingly, he ate a lot longer then and was a lot slower in giving the start button. So I do a smaller exposure again, just pretty much picking up the towel, moving it around a bit before I feed him. And I actually tried to speed things up by giving him smaller amount of food, and that in fact seemed to slow things down, because he spent even more time eating and rummaging around for every last crumb in the bucket. So I do a little bit more flapping of the towel this time. and give him more food this time. Even the amount of food you give them in a session is information for them. And although we're not shaping behaviour and we're not reinforcing behaviour, the amount of food can still give them information, just as the way they eat can give me information. So a little bit harder exposure there, where I've held the towel up over his back again. And he ate a lot quicker there, gave the start button. And I'm just going to do more fiddling with the towel there. And he seems semi-okay with that. It's hard to see his expression in his eye in a video, but I'm watching his expression really carefully. And also the way he stands, how he eats, how fast he eats, which way he's leaning, towards me or away from me. I'm also planning what the next exposure is going to be. So I go back to just flapping, but for a little bit longer. So that's again a bigger exposure, and I end there. So I always wait for his start button, a head nod. This time I'm going back to hovering over his back. And I've moved the bucket because it did look like he was looking away, but it could have just been the position of the bucket that made it look that way. But he's taking a long time to eat. But it looked like he actually continued to chew through that exposure. So that's great progress from the first and second time where it touched his back and he stopped eating, which potentially could be a freeze. It could also be him just listening and concentrating to what I'm doing, so he stops chewing to be able to hear well. So he's chewed through that, so that's a really good sign, because that was a much bigger exposure again. I put it on and I fiddled with it. So this is more flow than ebb. We're going a little bit more forward in the exposures. And you can see how you can get a bit of momentum up with this type of conditioning, where do a few easy ones, do a harder one, go back to an easy one or two, and then try a harder one or the same. This time I open the towel up, so that's quite a big leap, and he stops chewing. So I think, okay, he wasn't okay with that, or because I did it the first time, he stopped chewing to go, that was different. It felt different, and I could most likely he could see it out of his peripheral vision, because donkeys have really excellent vision alongside and behind them. And I really don't know Seymour's history, so I don't know about whether he's been rugged or saddled or had anything like this put on his back. So I do a lesser exposure with the towel folded, and just again do the exposure that was successful before, putting it on and gently just wiggling it a little bit. Always make sure that he's really definite about the start button. And you saw there I went back to the harder exposure and he chewed through it, so that was a good sign. So I was happy to end there. And for the last session the sun came out, So I start off a little bit easy at the start of each session. I could already see he looked a bit, and it took a while for him to do the start button. So they're all really important bits of information that I'm observing as I go along. So you see I go back to something, well, I wouldn't say it's really easy, but a lesser exposure because of observing his body language. Because it would be very easy to say, oh, last session, let's see if we can do something really amazing. But it's about him feeling 100% happy and comfortable and eventually loving whatever the thing is that I'm putting on his back. So pushing too hard is not going to be good.
Good.
He stopped chewing there. He did a little chew. So I'm probably doing what I said I shouldn't be doing, in that I've done a much bigger exposure and left it on him. And this is where, again, the ebb and flow works, where you push a little bit hard, see how he responds now that we've done a couple of sessions, and then reevaluate, and you might go for a few easier. Stop chewing for all of those. So I'm doing much more challenging exposures here and seeing how he responds. And then I may go to something easier to finish. Remembering that this isn't reinforcing behaviour, this is conditioning. So we're pairing the stimulus, which is the towel, with food. So we've always got to keep him feeling good and comfortable.
Good.
And although he stopped chewing, as I said, it could be concern, or it could be just listening and concentrating on what I'm doing. And I wasn't seeing any other indicators of concern. So I've continued with the towel staying on his back and just moving it around. On the head nod, the start button.
Good.
It's fairly slow, so I've taken the towel off. So every time he's eating, I'm evaluating, shall I do the same exposure? Shall I do a shorter, quicker, easier exposure? Or shall I push for a little bit more bigger exposure? So you can see there I've gone back to a smaller exposure of the folded towel, but still left it on his back. Because from memory, that exposure previously he was okay with. So maybe one step forward. So I do fiddling around with it, rolling it, but it's smaller, because I suspected the longer towel dangling down his sides may have been what's concerning him. Whereas the shorter towel sitting up higher is of less concern. And I'm waving to Dorothy, who's watching very intently in the next training area. And Seymour's very subtle with his head nods. That's looking really good there.
Good.
His chewing even looked at me a little bit. head knot. And there I went for a much bigger exposure, slightly unfolding the towel, which would be one of my next steps a bit later. And he went a little bit quiet for a moment when I did that, stopped chewing. And I think I saw a little bit of tension in his face as well. I know it's hard because he's very woolly, but when you get to know your animal really well, you can see those signs. So I figured opening the towel out was not okay, but then we noticed that the first time of every time we do a stronger exposure, they're a bit unsure, and then the next time they're much more comfortable. So that's always something to keep in mind.